The oldest recorded male contraceptive method requires no tools, no money, no preparation, just a decision, withdrawal, and the oldest written record of it ends with the man dead. Genesis chapter 38. A man named Onan is instructed by his father to sleep with his dead brother's wife, Tamar, and produce an heir for the family. Onan goes through with the act, but deliberately spills his seed on the ground so no child would be born. God kills him for it. Theologians argued for centuries about exactly why. Was the sin the act itself, or Onan's refusal to provide Tamar with an heir? The debate never resolved. What resolved immediately was the official position: unacceptable. The act got named after him: Onanism, condemned in Jewish law, then Christian doctrine, then Islamic scholarship. 3 major world religions lined up to condemn a single contraceptive method. It didn't stop anyone. Withdrawal remained one of the most widely practiced methods across the ancient world, through the medieval period and well into the modern era, because it cost nothing, required no physician, no plant, no preparation. The only input required was male reliability in a single moment. And here's what the historical record shows about that. Physicians in ancient Rome wrote about men who promised withdrawal and didn't follow through. The Talmud contains formal arguments, specific, detailed arguments, about exactly when the method was permissible and when it wasn't. Those debates exist because failure was common enough that society needed formal rules. Informal trust had already proven insufficient. The most accessible method in human history, free, always available, required nothing external, still failed constantly. Which raises the obvious question: if men had a free option and still didn't use it reliably, what were they doing instead? The answer starts in a city most people have never heard of, built around a plant that no longer exists. Around 630 BC, Greek settlers landed on the North African coast and built a city called Cyrene, in what is now northeastern Libya. Cities need something to sell. Cyrene found theirs almost immediately. Not olive oil, not grain, not fish. A plant. It grew in the hills behind the city, in a specific band of terrain between the coastline and the desert interior. Farmers tried to cultivate it in Greece, in Egypt, in Italy. Every attempt failed. The plant seemed to belong to that one stretch of hillside, and nowhere else on earth. It was called Silphium, and according to multiple ancient sources, women who consumed it in the days following sex did not become pregnant. Now, Silphium is extinct. We cannot study it directly or run modern trials. But consider this. Soranus of Ephesus, a physician writing in the 2nd century AD, listed Silphium juice among the reliable contraceptives in his surviving text, Gynecology. Soranus matters here because he was careful enough to distinguish between methods he trusted and methods he doubted, skeptical enough that his endorsements actually meant something. He trusted Silphium. Modern botanists examining related plants still growing in the same region, several Ferula species in the same botanical family, have found compounds that demonstrably interfere with fertility in animal studies. The pharmacological logic is plausible. Something in that hillside was doing something real. The city of Cyrene minted Silphium onto their coins. The stalk on one face, the seed on the other. You don't put things on government currency for decoration. You put them there when they're the reason everything else works. Here's what happened next. Wealthy Romans wanted Silphium for their kitchens and their medicine cabinets. At the same time, demand from across the Mediterranean descended on those hills behind Cyrene. Nobody successfully farmed it. It was always harvested wild, from the same slopes, season after season, with no reserve and no plan for the day the supply stopped. The supply stopped. Pliny the Elder recorded the end of it in a single sentence. The last known stalk of Silphium was sent to Emperor Nero as a curiosity, something unusual to taste before it was gone entirely. One stalk. An emperor ate it as a novelty. That was the end of what might have been the most effective contraceptive the ancient world ever produced. And nobody, not one ancient writer, recorded any effort to conserve it. No argument for restraint. No proposal to leave some portion of the harvest in the ground. The disappearance was noted, and then the subject was changed. The most effective contraceptive of the ancient world, gone. Not by disease, not by war, not by climate, by appetite. In 1889, archaeologists excavating the Egyptian city of Lahun uncovered a medical document written around 1825 BC. It is now held in University College London. It is called the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, and it is one of the oldest medical texts ever recovered. It describes a pessary, a substance inserted internally to prevent pregnancy, made from crocodile dung, sour milk, and fermented plant material. Before you move past that, the chemistry is more interesting than the ingredients suggest. Crocodile dung is alkaline. Fermented material is acidic. The resulting mixture likely altered the internal environment in ways genuinely hostile to sperm, not through magic, but through basic biochemistry that Egyptian physicians had no vocabulary to name. A second formula in the same document used acacia gum, honey, and dates. Acacia ferments into lactic acid. Lactic acid is an active ingredient in certain modern spermicides. Someone, thousands of years ago, observed something, wrote it down, and other physicians copied it for generations. That is empirical medicine, without the framework to explain itself. Now, read the Kahun papyrus carefully, not for what it contains, but for what it doesn't. There is no male method, not a single line. Read Soranus after that. Then Aristotle's notes on fertility. Then Dioscorides, the Roman military physician whose pharmacological text was copied for 15 centuries. Same structure, every time. The patient is always the woman. The physician advises the woman. The woman prepares the mixture, applies the method, and bears the risk if it fails. The man appears only as the implied reason the physician is needed. This is not one writer's blind spot. It is the consistent shape of ancient contraceptive medicine across Egypt, Greece, and Rome, spanning more than 1,000 years. Written by physicians who clearly understood male reproductive biology, who described withdrawal accurately, who knew exactly what onan did and why it worked. They understood. They simply never developed that understanding into medicine addressed to male patients. Why? Because nobody asked them to. Soranus of Ephesus worked in Rome during the reigns of Trajan and Hadrian, roughly 98 to 138 AD. His text Gynecology survived when most ancient medical writing didn't. It was copied through the Byzantine period, translated into Latin, circulated through medieval European monasteries. It survived because it was useful. Physicians kept reaching for it. He made a distinction that was genuinely ahead of his time: contraceptives versus abortifacients, prevention versus termination. He preferred contraception on clinical grounds, less dangerous for the woman. That reasoning is in the text. It is not modern thinking projected backwards onto ancient history. His contraceptive recommendations included cedar oil, olive oil, pomegranate pulp mixed with galbanum resin, and Silphium. Cedar oil and olive oil create physical and chemical barriers with documented effects on sperm. The pomegranate mixture. Modern researchers have found that pomegranate seed extracts show estrogenic activity in animal studies. Not conclusive, but not random either. He also recommended white lead, which was genuinely toxic and would have caused serious harm with repeated exposure. Soranus had no mechanism to know that. He was working from observation, not from chemistry he could explain. Here is what makes Soranus worth paying attention to, beyond the accuracy of individual recommendations. He wrote instructions detailed enough to actually follow. Timing, preparation, consistency. He understood that a method used incorrectly was not a method at all. He cared, clinically, about whether his patients succeeded. And then, he addressed every single recommendation to women. He knew what withdrawal was. He described it. He chose not to build it into a clinical method with instructions, dosage, and contraindications. He chose not to write a chapter for male patients. Not because he forgot, because the demand from the people who commissioned, read, and paid for medical texts wasn't there. Which brings us to the beliefs that filled the gap instead. And one of them is so convenient for men, so perfectly timed to remove accountability, that what happens next is almost hard to believe. Medieval Europe inherited Rome's medical tradition and added its own contributions. Some of them were creative. In several European medical texts, men seeking to avoid fatherhood were advised to carry amulets made from weasel testicles. The logic was sympathetic magic. Carry the reproductive organs of an animal. Neutralize your own fertility. This was not folk superstition dismissed by serious thinkers. It appeared in medical writing, recommended by people who considered themselves physicians. Imagine going to a doctor and leaving with a small pouch of weasel parts. For medical reasons, there were specific prayers, saints associated with childbirth who could, theoretically, be petitioned in reverse, lunar calendars, ritual timings. Notice what all of these have in common. They required almost nothing from the man. Wear a pouch. Say a prayer. Check the calendar. But the belief with the longest reach wasn't about amulets. It started with Galen. Galen of Pergamon, writing in the 2nd century AD, argued that women produced a seed of their own during sexual climax, and that conception required the merging of both seeds. The implication followed directly. No female pleasure, no female seed, no conception. Without pleasure, pregnancy was biologically impossible. This was completely false. Anatomically, demonstrably, mechanically, false. The structure Galen described does not exist. It persisted in European medical literature until the 1700s. Think about that. 1500 years. Copied into new editions of medical texts, cited by physicians, repeated in courts of law. Because here is what it meant in practice. A man could, after the fact, reason his way to a particular conclusion about whether a pregnancy was possible based on what he decided a woman must have experienced. If she conceived, she must have felt pleasure. If she felt pleasure, the encounter was consensual. If it was consensual, the responsibility was shared, or hers. The belief appeared in legal records. It entered arguments about paternity. It provided a framework for dismissing pregnancies in circumstances where dismissal was convenient. A false idea, anatomically disproven, preserved in textbooks for over a millennium. The Weasel testicle amulets eventually disappeared. Nobody cites them anymore. The pleasure theory took considerably longer to die. In 1494, something arrived in Europe that changed the calculation entirely. Not a new contraceptive, a disease, syphilis. It moved through armies and trading routes with a speed that left physicians without explanation. Within a decade, it had reached England, Scotland, Hungary, Russia, and India. The symptoms were visible and progressive: sores, rashes, then neurological deterioration that could take years to kill. Nobody knew what caused it. Nobody had a treatment. Men with the most sexual access died fastest. For the first time in history, men had a strong personal incentive to think seriously about protection. Not for someone else's sake, for their own survival. The response was a sheath. Gabriel Fallopius, the Italian anatomist whose name was later given to the fallopian tubes, which is the kind of legacy that requires no further comment, published a claim in 1564 that he had designed a linen sheath soaked in a chemical solution and tested it on 1,100 men, with 0 syphilis cases in his group. The number is almost certainly exaggerated, but linen sheaths existed. Men in Italian cities were using them. Later versions were made from cleaned sheep intestine, softened in water before use, tied at the base with a small ribbon. Merchants sold them near taverns in London and Paris, expensive enough that men kept them, washed them, dried them, and used them again. Imagine trusting a reused piece of sheep intestine, tied with a ribbon, and stored in a coat pocket, with the question of whether you would still be alive in 5 years. That was the leading male contraceptive technology for roughly 3 centuries. And even then, even with syphilis generating visible deaths in every major European city, even with a personal survival incentive that no earlier contraceptive method had ever carried, many men still found reasons to avoid them. Too uncomfortable. Too expensive. Too much interruption. The Catholic Church condemned them. A French cardinal described them as a barrier against the love of God. Courts in some regions discussed restricting their sale entirely. The technology finally existed. For the first time in history, men had a practical method they controlled, could use consistently, and had every reason to use. The gap, by this point, was no longer about technology at all. Stand back from everything. Egyptian physicians writing exclusively for female patients in 1825 BC. Greek and Roman texts spanning 5 centuries, addressed entirely to women. A plant minted onto government currency, consumed to extinction without a single recorded argument for conservation. A false medical belief, anatomically disproven, preserved in textbooks for 1,500 years. Early condoms avoided by significant numbers of the men they were designed to protect, even when those men were dying of a disease the condom could prevent. The thread running through all of it isn't ignorance. Ancient physicians understood male reproductive biology. They described withdrawal in accurate clinical terms. Soranus understood the difference between prevention and termination. Egyptian physicians understood chemistry they had no language to name. Aristotle made accurate fertility observations from anatomically incorrect premises. What the evidence shows, across chapter after chapter, is a recurring arrangement. Whose body carried the method? Whose discomfort was negotiable? Whose preparation was assumed? That arrangement wasn't designed by any single person or decreed by any single institution. It emerged from thousands of small decisions, each one fitting naturally into the existing shape of a world where pregnancy fell on women directly and on men only at a distance, with room to negotiate. Nobody designed the Cahun Papyrus to exclude male methods. Soranus didn't sit down intending to write 1,000 years of precedent. The cardinal who condemned condoms wasn't thinking primarily about burden distribution. Each of these things happened for their own reasons. Together, they tell a consistent story. In the hills outside Cyrene, nothing grows where Silphium used to grow. The soil is still there. The slope, the Mediterranean light, the specific microclimate that produced something no other place on Earth could replicate. The plant is gone. Pliny noted it in one sentence, and moved on. The story of ancient contraception isn't really about strange ingredients or forgotten methods. Those are just the surface. Underneath is a question every civilization in this video answered in roughly the same way, across thousands of miles, thousands of years, without ever quite stating it out loud. When a problem belongs to everyone, who actually has to solve it? The answer, written in every papyrus, every court record, and every extinct plant species in this story, is whoever had the least power to decline. That's the history. Whether anything has changed since then, that's a question you can answer yourself.